I launched a second book of poems called Arrivederci Plastic Covered Couch, and which really is a phrase, a remembrance of my parents' generation that unfortunately passed too soon. My parents, I think, died about 20 years ago. And in many ways, when we were young, we didn't appreciate a lot of the things that they did, toil, the hard work, and wanting things to last forever by wrapping them in plastic, which we know nothing lasts forever, and everything's impermanent. But yet, that did prevent them from trying. But one of the things I want to read, just getting back to the whole thing of heritage, is a poem about, I think it's a breed that's vanished, or maybe it's just re-emerged as recyclers. Maybe the blue box is a symbol of it, but back in the early 60s, I remember the ragman coming up the street where I lived, and it was quite magical because they used to drive horses and buggies, and you never saw them except on television during the Western times. So this is called the Arikuman, or the Ragman Song. In those days, when Westerns were the rage on TV, I watched them all, although there were no real horses to be seen in my neighborhood, except for the one that pulled an old wagon that came by once in a while. From my second-story bedroom on a drowsy summer vacation day, I could hear the clip-clop, 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 and the odd sound of wagon wheels on asphalt. Arising from the street below was a Paul Robeson voice, crooning, "Ariku, Ariku." That was followed by a chorus of screen doors slamming, accompanied by excited voices of babysitting aunts, spinster neighbors, calling at the Arikuman to stop, and he pulled the reins of his aged nag until it came to a halt. From my upstairs window, I saw the widow Antonella carry down a sack of her dead husband's clothes and a crippled chair. The spinster Anne, with her broken mirrors and torn dresses, gave them to the Arikuman, who would make them new again. And when the Arikuman got his fill, he snapped his reins and brought his suffering nag to life, and, like a weary cowboy, searching for that lost passage, calling out his mournful "Areku, Areku," he began up the street. In Toronto, growing up in Toronto, we didn't have much nature, except for our parks. And I think Toronto and some of the other great southern Ontario cities have got a wealth of parks and enough wilderness for people who, at certain stages of their lives, can't make it out to the real countryside. But for me, growing up, Christie Pitts was really, that park by Christie and Bloor was really the place to go. And it was like on a Sunday, it was like a magical place that had anything you could think of. They used to have baseball games, they still do, with the Toronto Maple Leafs playing there. And they used to have the baseball Leafs. They used to have the little boys selling pop out of their, they used to buy them for about 5 cents and then sell them for about 20 cents. They used to go from picnic to picnic. And they used to have a marvelous, the pool's still there. It was the Alex Duff pool with a 3-deck tower, a diving tower that led to a lot of myths, or maybe they were true, of people diving too shallow or missing the diving board and ending up killing themselves. But it was a source of wonderment. This is called Christie Pitts. The closest thing to a circus for me was going to Christie Pitts on a Sunday afternoon after Mass and our Sunday meal, when mothers, aunts, and a parade of sisters, brothers, and cousins marched to that sunken dugout that dipped well below Bloor Street, so it looked as if the old Bloor streetcar rode on air. We threw out our bodies to the ground, and we rolled into the pits, tumbling over and over and over the grassy hill until we lay dizzy on the bottom, and watched the blue sky spin. Under the trees, the men played serious card games. Our mothers steered us away from their rising voices and cards slamming on picnic tables. At the other end was the Alex Duff pool, with its 3-deck tower, and myths about ripped stomachs of belly-flopping boys, and the girl who smashed her head on the deck below. I found my playground thrill climbing the airplane monkey bars, my sister boldly sliding up the giant elephant slide, while cousins spun the horseless merry-go-round, and boys made the girls scream with joy by bouncing too rough on the wooden teeter-totter. And then I guess I want to read one more, because since I'm out in the country, I want to read as many of the nature-y type poems I have in this rather urban collection. This one's called Un giorno in campagna, which means a day in the country in Italian. But the story behind it is that my name is Giorno, and I ran into this marvelous sculptress named Julie Campagna. So what a wonderful name, you know, one we can get together sometime, Giorno in Campagna. And I actually used it, and then she slapped my face. No, she didn't. But I used a photograph of one of her statues. She's called it the Bag Lady, and it's basically a very voluptuous statue, bronze statue, laying, you know, in a reclined position with a lady's purse over her head. And I was able to put in the photograph. I was able to take that statue and put it by the banks of the Humber River. So we call this Un giorno in campagna, and it goes something like this. When the air is full of the first scent of summer, and the day seduces us away from work, I spend un giorno in campagna with you. A bottle of wine uncorked, under a canopy of oaks, on the banks of the river by the Albion Hills. We make garlands of yellow lily flowers, and wear them as if we were king and queen, in this our special day, lazing by the waters. We watch the fish swim between moist tunnels, entering wedges of passages, slippery with pleasure. At the thrill of coming through on the other side, we eat clams and corn on the cob, and taste their sweetness. We drink wine, traces spilling red that I kiss away from your breast, on this giorno in campagna with you. A few more?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
I grew up at a time where, you know, my parents came over. There was quite a bit of, you know, turmoil in the family as they kind of adjusted to the difference between the culture of the Southern Italian peasant lifestyle, which is basically out of the 14th century, very, very much feudal, into a bustling, emerging industrial city like Toronto. And one of the things that many people did is they, to make ends meet, they rented the upstairs to a tenant. And we had a very gracious fellow who was a TTC driver, and this poem is dedicated to him. It's called The Man Upstairs. I was taught early and often by priests from Baltimore catechisms that the man upstairs had a name, and that name was unpronounceable, Yahweh. Though we always pronounced it anyway, with smirking schoolboy chutzpah. Back at home, we actually had a man upstairs who paid the rent by the month, and we called him Arnold Edward Parks. And he spoke with an English accent, though not the Queen's English. And Mr. Parks was a leader of men, for he drove the city bus, and he showed us the way when we were lost. He helped us transfer safely and make the right connections. I always thought he was a guardian angel. He never flinched or whined. He never left the house, or he never moved away when Dad became an incendiary device and exploded in the night. My dad had a temper.
Dad did it.
How many people do remember Gunsmoke in Marshall Dillon? The big opening where, you know, you see the back of his guns, and then he's pulling it down, and of course, Dillon never drew first. The guy down at the other end always drew first, but the Marshall Dillon was so fast that he always ended up killing the bad guy. Well, we had a marshal, and he actually lived not too far from where I grew up. He lived in Witchwood Park, and he was a big, tall guy, and he was sort of a very famous marshal in his own right. Every Monday night, when Marshal Dillon strode towards the bad guy with his trigger hand dangling loosely by his side, he never drew first, but he always fired first, and the gun smoke billowed in the air as the Undertaker measured the unmoving figure for a pine box. At that time, I learned we had a marshal of our own right here in this town. I'm referring to Toronto. He didn't carry a gun, but he knew which medium was the message. And he knew which medium was hot and which was cool. He lived in Witchwood Park, by the magical goldfish pond, not very far from me. I saw him on the CBC massaging his message. I could almost see the smoke rising from the pumping pistons of his mind that left me feeling he was simply on another planet. Every Halloween, we children used to go to his door and knock, and we would sing, "Hey, Marshall McLuhan, what are you doing? Thinking green socks or simply soft shoeing? Hey, Marshall McLuhan, what do you mean?" Kindly explained with chocolate and jelly beans. And I thought it was great to be able to come over from Italy, and 6 years later, 7 years later, whatever, we see Marshall McLuhan walking down the street. It's kind of quite something. I'll read one more. And perhaps what I'll read, since we're talking about heritage, is I'll read Dufferin Street, which to Italians, and I guess to many people in Toronto, is definitely a heritage street in that it touched so many. I'm not sure how many of you people today read the Sunday Star. There's a story about Tony Galliano, and he just recently, about a year or two ago, took over as the publisher of Toronto Life. And one of the things I noticed is he grew up in St. Clair and in Dufferin. So if you get a chance to read the article, it's just fascinating. Dufferin Street. And this is also about language and how children adapt to language rather quickly, and to make it easier for children, not us anymore, but at that time, to learn new languages. Listening to the sawing sound of the ancient cicadas through Toronto's summer heat, leaning against American cars whose fins were as sharp as shark's teeth, the magical word Dufferin would reverberate through my brain and work its way to my mouth and tongue that uttered, "Dufferin, Dufferin, Dufferin." And my friends and I would laugh at the absurdity of this English word. Dufferin Street was our mothers shepherding us to Dufferin Plaza for clothes, and across the street was Dufferin Park. And fun, oh boy! And the playground just over the hill, which seemed so big. And sometimes the ice cream truck would come by, yum! And Dufferin Street had this magical bus that took us to the exhibition where we squealed, holding on for our lives on shaky roller coasters. Dufferin Street was my family dressing up on Sunday, taking the bus north to St. Clair, and wondering if it would ever make it up the Davenport Hill on the way to visit cousins, uncles, and aunts. Dufferin Street was ugly, with peeling houses, covered with dusty auto exhaust, but it was our ticket out of our sleepy, charmed College Street village. Dufferin Street was the perspiration rolling off tired faces, and we rode that sweat to the Highway 401 in 401, where we saw the world stretched out before us. Dufferin, Buffrin, Suffrin. We shouted out, "Have a headache?" And like Scruffy Sparrow, we replied, "Take a Dufferin." "You need new clothes? Well, take that Buffrin bus to Suffrin Plaza." And boy, did we ever laugh at the sounds of that, of the words of this chameleon language, which we didn't realize was slowly turning into our home. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. That was awesome. Our last speaker only